Hello and welcome everyone, whatever time you happen to find yourself in. My name is Daniel Rowe and I'm the Director of Academic Programs here at the Rothermere American Institute in Oxford. And it's my delight today to welcome you to the third seminar in this year's Analog series. The seminar is a virtual event series that showcases cutting-edge research in African American history, politics, biography and culture. And it does so through book talks and panel discussions like we have today. The series is intended partially to highlight the Vere Harmsworth Library in Oxford's Alan Locke collection, which holds collections in African American history and culture, and to shine a spotlight on research in African American history and culture taking place in Oxford. And all of us here at the Rothermere American Institute and in Oxford more generally are very grateful to the Association of American Rhodes Scholars for the support that they provide that makes this growing and important collection possible. Likewise, I'm very grateful today to Camille Mimi Borders, one of our RAI MPhil alums and a former Rhodes Scholar, for making and organizing this event possible. So with that, I'll hand over to Mimi and she can introduce our panelists and lead the show from here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you to the RAI and the American Association of Rhodes Scholars for funding the Elaine Locke Seminar Series. While I was at Oxford, the RAI was my scholarly home, and it's really exciting to see the ways that it has continued to grow. So we're going to get into it. Today, we have the pleasure of engaging with two stellar scholars of Black women's history in the 19th century, Dr. Emily Owens and Dr. Kaisha Esty. So Dr. Emily Owens is an associate professor of history at Brown University and the author of Consent in the Presence of Force, Sexual Violence and Black Women's Survival in Antebellum New Orleans. I have the book. I'll show it. I love the cover. So get yourself a copy if you do not have it. The book tells stories of enslaved women who were conscripted into brothels, concubinage, or the so-called fancy trade to historicize the legal mechanisms and economic structures that produce slavery's violent sexual culture. This book highlights the poverty of consent as a legal and political concept that might protect women from sexual harm. Owens has received support from the Institute for Citizens and Scholars, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Library Company of Philadelphia, and the Charles Warren Center for American History. She is also a proud alumna of the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship. Dr. Kaisha Esty is an assistant professor of Wesleyan University, specializing in slavery, sexuality, empire, and Black womanhood in the 19th century. She is completing her first book, Weaponizing Virtue, Black Women and Intimate Resistance in the Age of U.S. Expansion, and is a 2024 to 2025 American Postdoctoral Fellow with the American Association of University Women, and recently completed her term as a fellow in residence at Oxford's RAI. She is the author of, quote, I told him to let me alone, that he hurt me. Black women and girls in the battle over labor and sexual consent in Union-occupied territory. It was originally published in Labor Studies in Working Class History, and the article won the Association of Black Women Historians Letitia Woods Brown Article Prize in 2022. Her research has been supported by the American Historical Association, the African American Intellectual History Society, and the Arts and Humanities Research Council, among others. So I'm grateful again for both of you agreeing to this in January and coming today to join me this afternoon, and everyone in the audience. We're going to start with some questions, and if we have time, we'll open up to the audience, but we might be too busy chatting. So in the audience today, we have historians, non-historians, Americanists. We also have my advisor from my time at Oxford. Hi, Stephen. all of that to say, we have people from very different areas of expertise. So I just want you, if you can, in a sentence or two, explain the central research questions of your work in this moment.
Sure. Maybe I'll start. Mimi, thank you so much for inviting me and inviting us. And thank you to the RAI for hosting this event. And thank you for that introduction. So when I wrote Consent in the Presence of Force, I think that the project evolved a lot over time because it began as my dissertation and it's really changed over the course of revision. But I would say that the central questions that drive the version of the project that's become the book, or maybe also a little different, therefore, than the questions I started with in grad school, but I'll get back to that maybe later. The central questions that drive the book are really about trying to understand what violence was, what sexual violence was in the antebellum South, what it looked like, what it felt like, what kinds of conceptual discourses shaped people's understanding of sexual violence, and what kinds of legal and political and economic mechanisms were the engine of sexual violence. And then on the other side of that, I really want to understand what it meant to endure that kind of culture of sexual terror through the lives of Black women who sometimes survived it and sometimes did not, but were always strategizing through that scenario. So it's sort of trying to understand the culture of violence on one side, how it worked, what made it tick, and trying to understand Black women's survival strategies. And really, I think ultimately those things work together because it's my fundamental conceit in that project that starting with the survival strategies and the discernment of Black women is going to help me better understand what the structure of those violences were. So that's kind of how the book operates as a narrative and as a methodological project.
Thanks also to Mimi and to the RAI for this invitation to be in conversation. So my first book project that I'm still working on also comes out of my dissertation, which really looked at enslaved and later freed women's sort of notions and values around ideals, moral ideals around sexuality. So chastity was like a major idea. And I was just really interested in enslaved women's knowledge of their own positionality within the system of slavery and what it meant that they adhered to some of these ideals, knowing that the ideals themselves were often and always in contradiction to their sort of material lives and lived experiences. And then also what it meant that they sort of passed down many of these ideas to their offspring. And so from there became the sort of seed of thinking about sexual and moral values as an area of resistance that has been sort of overlooked, I should say, within enslaved communities. So it made me think a lot about, as I sort of transitioned into the book project, the ways in which rebellions and other overt physical forms of resistance have been sort of held up and discussed as like major forms of enslaved resistance. And I was really interested in the sort of the everyday, the smaller kind of day-to-day minute forms of resistance, and that were not only coded as female or as the forms of resistance that women engaged in, because they also engaged in other forms of resistance, but sort of asking the question of how enslaved women's sexual and moral values then informed the broader resistive cultures of enslaved communities.
Mm-hmm.
And so the term weaponizing virtue, which is sort of the working title, is really a nod to that kind of origin point. And the book has expanded to thinking about Black women, enslaved women's intimate resistance against a backdrop, a sort of larger structural backdrop of US expansion and nation building. And so it's really trying to sort of understand slavery and by extension, the US nation's sort of dependence on Black women's bodies and their sort of sexual labor, the exploitation of their sexual labor and reproductive labor for its survival, for its perpetuation, for its sense of identity, right? And trying to tell this story through an intimate lens, focusing on enslaved women themselves, but also going beyond abolition and thinking about the continuation of these ideas into the late 19th century.
Yes, I'm so excited for the book. Both of you are really getting at this point that enslaved women's knowledge, the ways that they were knowing, using them as epistemological vocal cords is kind of the starting point. The ways that they strategize, the ways that they form communities is integral to your work, both of your work. And I really today wanted to think about how you both are talking about sexual violence. So you unearthed narratives of sexual violence. Dr. Owens, you specifically pointed to moments of ordinary violence, how violence and intimacy were intrinsically connected in Black women's lived experiences. Dr. Esty, you engage in how Black women's labor, particularly during the Civil War and during Reconstruction, was intertwined with Black women's presumed sexual availability. In turn, this violence that was then inflicted on them by Union troops is one of the those testimonies are core to your article. With that in mind, I want to ask both literally and methodologically, as you were turning the pages of these testimonies, of these legal documents, how do you enter this grotesque and violent archive of sexual violence? The marks that are left on Black women's bodies, both physically and psychologically, you engage in both of them. So how do you do it? We can start with Dr. Esty.
Oh, sure. Okay.
Yeah.
I think the first thing I would say is it was a process of sort of trial and error where I tried to figure out ways in which I can enter the physical archive and engage these documents and not and sort of maintain the sensitivity that I think will always stay with me. You know, I never want to be desensitized to this material, but sort of learn how to develop ways to establish a sort of critical distance, right? When as a grad student, when I sort of approached these materials, I was very much thinking of my work as an act of recovery. And I have since become a little uncomfortable with that term because of the kind of inherent power that it seems to suggest on the part of the historian. I see my work now as a work of just acknowledging the dignity of these historical figures. And so there's a way in which I have developed tools outside of academia that has helped my reading and writing and also teaching practices. So I have developed training as a consent forward practitioner. I am also, I've done a lot of like intimacy work, trauma informed, ethically engaged storytelling. Those kind of tools have helped me not only sort of approach these records in a way that enables me to listen to my own body and to sort of step away, to breathe, to meditate, to do, you know, what I need to do necessary. It's helped me with my sort of empathy and approach to the historical subjects themselves, but it's also helped me with providing tools to my students who, you know, take classes with me and engage some of this material. And I do find it's partly my responsibility to help them develop some tools for approaching this kind of work in the first place. Critical historiography, you know, nod to, you know, scholars such as Sadia Hartman and you know, Marisa Fuentes and others. You know, I'm coming out of the sort of like Rutgers history PhD program. So,
Yes.
you know, it was just kind of ambient. It was there. I developed many tools from just being in that space to sort of help inform my reading practice as well. But it really is just an ongoing thing. As I said, I never want to be desensitized to it, but I just find that turning away is just not an option.
Yes.
So yeah.
Yeah. And I think Deborah Gray White, right, in that environment, as in her first articles in the book, really the lineage that all three of us are a part of, she lays instructions for how we tend and how we sit to these archives. Dr. Owens.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think I think that the frame of desensitization that you brought up, Kaisha, is really smart, because I think that's the presumption when you're doing this kind of work, that like you're so immersed in narratives of violence that you become inured to them. And that's not quite right, but you do develop, or I do develop, like I sometimes catch myself that I have developed an ability to tolerate these stories, that sometimes when I interact with people who are not used to working in these archives, I catch myself like, oh wait, like this might be more intense of an experience for someone who's new to this story. So it's somewhere in between. It's not about not being sensitive to the material at all, but it's actually about having had to develop a set of internal, intellectual, and I think also kind of emotional, heart-centered tools to be able to be with this material. I would also say that, there's a good friend and of mine who's also someone who's really trained me is Jennifer Nash, and she starts her first book on pornography with this amazing moment that resonates, I think, with a lot of people who study Black women in lots of circumstances. She says that when she was writing the book on Black women in pornography, that people kept saying to her, like, oh gosh, that just sounds so hard. And of course, the book is about pleasure, and it's about laughter, and it's about all these other things that are not actually about violence. But the way that violence and sadness and harm over determines the space of thinking about Black women's sexuality is also like a kind of bugbear for me. Like as much as like I am not desensitized to these moments, and I do experience this archival work as something that needs to happen slowly, and for which I have developed like my sensibility of the story that became consent in the presence of force took a long time. And I'm glad it took a long time, which is partially about a kind of slow titrating archival practice. So that's one thing. But on the other hand, it's also not this like hand-wringing experience of like, oh, it's so hard, right? Like these experiences are hard in a deep sort of bone-chilling kind of way. And I think particularly because I work with legal archives, that is like more fully expressed, because the legal archives are extremely cold. They are not often very graphic in terms of the kinds of violence that is articulated. They're occasionally graphic, but they are much more likely to normalize and basically hide the particulars of the material bodily violence and sexual violence that enslaved women endured. And so one develops a kind of way of listening to those documents in order to understand what's really going on there, but also like I don't watch scary movies. I don't like graphic violence. I don't tolerate that well at all. I really don't do that at all. And actually at some point a long time ago, I heard that Caretha Mitchell used to say, I'm a scholar of lynching, so I'm serious about fun. So like, on the one hand, like the kind of spectacularized violence, it's like really not on my radar at all. Like I can't handle that. And also like fun and pleasure and gardening and laughter are a huge part of my personal life, and also have everything to do with the way that I approach these archives. But also the particular kinds of archives that I work with tend to be atonal. They tend to be dispassionate. And that actually tells me a lot about what the social context of this violence looked like. And that's really what helped me. Once I realized, oh, this is what I've been looking at all this time, and straining for kind of details of what women experienced, that really kind of opened up the frame of ordinary violence for me, of like, oh, wait, it's all right here all the time in this very atonal way. And anyway, that just changes the way that I experience the actual archival work. And then the last thing I would say is that, you know, Kaisha, what you said about sort of developing these adjacent skills that interact with your archival practice really resonates with me. And I think that as I became a teacher while I was writing this first book, like those things coincided. My sense of what storytelling is and what it's for really changed, and the centrality of story became much more important to me. So like my graduate school dissertating space was much more about puzzles and figuring it out and unlocking a kind of like analytical universe, or analytical language that could help me explain this world. And I think the book is really driven by story and driven by narrative, and I think a kind of I learned to be emotionally available to myself as a writer while I was working on that book, which I think I was just like not super on my radar when I was kind of hammering out a dissertation. So I think that's also part of it, is like, I have a colleague here, Francoise Hamlin, who talks about the ethics of care as part of her oral history project. And I think that something in that space is related to the mode of writing that I feel like this kind of archive demanded, which again, honestly, is slow. Like, I think slowness is an undervalued tool in historical research in the context of like academic rat race pressures. But I think for me, like being able to move slowly and to write with deliberation sort of bore fruit that I didn't expect in the process itself.
Yes.
What you said, Emily, about the kind of courts that you engage with is really interesting to me, because it seems clear to me that by the period of the Civil War, especially within the military court, the context changes vastly.
Yeah.
So for, you know, not as much as, you know, one would like, but there are definitely more testimonies of, you know, women who are refugees, women and girls who are refugees, contraband, freed people. And because of the sort of nature of the court environment, there were often cases that I've come across where the assailant was allowed to cross-examine the woman that they had, a woman or girl that they had attached, and would use the court environment to sort of reproduce that violence, to relive that violence, and so insist on you know, the quote unquote victim sort of retelling everything that happened in graphic detail. So it's very different to, I guess, an earlier context where it's like there's still the question of the enslaved body in the court environment in the first place, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're totally different. And actually, I think that that's one of the startling, like the difference in the archives and the materials that we work with in the antebellum period and then Civil War and postbellum, it's around this particular question. It's so stark, which has at least in part something to do with consent and like the different relationship to rape law that African American women experience with this kind of critical shift in their relationship to citizenship. And so that's also this really interesting thing that I'd be interested to know where else that kind of, if ever, that kind of like really quite sudden shift in, you know, as you're saying in your work, Kaisha, the kind of self-conscious relationship to the law and to the state that Black women in this case have, like it shifts so quickly and they mobilize it immediately. It's like they know in, you know, I've got a case that's, you know, ends in well, it doesn't really ever end, but it's like, it's brought in 1861. And, you know, we don't know how this case ends because the war comes and into New Orleans. And so the case ends because it has to end. But, you know, in that case, that's a totally emblematic case of a woman who's saying like, there's all kinds of things that have happened to this woman that are terrible and horrific at the level of violence, and she's completely certain that the court doesn't give a damn, and so she makes the case on other grounds. She makes the case on the grounds of race and the grounds of property. And then, within 2 years, then 1 year, you have this flood of women who are turning toward the military courts, turning toward, eventually the KKK commissions, and saying, like, this happened to me. And
Yeah.
they have this, I think it's a great example of the strategic acumen and self-awareness and legal awareness, legal theorization that Black women have as enslaved actors and as formerly enslaved actors. Like, they know. The law recognizes me in a different way now, and it's instant. And I think that's like, that shift itself is worthy of historicization.
Yeah, I had a question about that precisely, the shift of the Civil War and the way that, particularly your interest in place, Dr. Owens, New Orleans, and then Dr. Esty, your interest in Civil War reconstruction, that rupture that happens in terms of Black women being able to testify in a different way. And so in some ways, Black women are appearing as nameless, and sometimes, especially in your work, Dr. Owens, they're not nameless.
Mm-hmm.
So what is your approach to legal documents, and what questions can they answer?
I mean, I think my approach to legal documents is necessity. Like, I came to the law because it existed, because it was a way in. I did not come to the law on purpose. I have become a legal historian, and I'm interested in the law. So it's not just like, I don't want to undercut, and just sort of say like, oh, it's just ridiculous. It's just random. It's not random. But I do think that case law in particular is a rare way to get at the specific stories of enslaved people in the antebellum period. And the stories that come through case law are sort of exceptional in that they often involve enslaved people who, in the case of Louisiana, sued for their freedom. But, like, Kimberly Welch's work has really shown that there's just like actually just a lot more people, a lot more enslaved people who are litigants across the whole South than we thought. So, like, in some ways, there is a specific kind of person who is maybe more well-resourced, more urban, more well-connected, who's able to pursue the courts. And that gives you a particular entry point into the history of slavery that maybe is not generalizable, but in other ways, maybe it is generalizable. And regardless, I think that it's a way into specific people's stories for which we just don't have that many ways in. And also there are, I think when you start looking at the legal archive and also maybe like the business archive, I think historians of capitalism have done this well. You can see the imprint of individual enslaved people, sometimes unnamed, often named, but, not fully sort of fleshed out as humans in these kinds of documents that are not deliberately about them. So, like, the cases that I read are cases in which enslaved women are at the center of the story. They're cases where they're the litigants, they're bringing the case. But then there are other cases that didn't end up in my book, but that I've read that are interesting, and that other people have engaged with as well, in which two white people are having a fight that ends up in the court, but an enslaved person is part of that story, whether it's a fight about property, the destruction of property because of excessive violence, whether it's about, it's often, honestly, property disputes of one kind or another. But the point is that, like, we get glimpses of specific people. I think it's hard to get glimpses of specific people in the archive of Antebellum US. And so for me, it's like using the law and learning to use the law is about, like, this is the opportunity that exists. So let's bring the tools that we have to bear on this particular collection, because it's otherwise, like, I'm just really not that fond of the argument that, like, we don't have anything to work with. We have weird stuff to work with, but, like, we have stuff. And I think the law is one of those kinds of archives.
Sometimes we have an excess of stuff to work with.
Indeed. Yeah.
Historians of slavery.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think the Union Courts Martial records in particular, for me, were an opportunity to, it's again,
Professor Esty,
yes.
could you explain kind of what the records are and specifically why the court or how the court was developed in this time period?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So these are records that emerged obviously during wartime. So they are specific to what's going on under Union Army occupation. And they're really about sort of litigating the conduct within Union occupied spaces. So it's about Union Army soldiers' conduct towards local communities, the sort of contraband camps, but also like the surrounding areas as well. And these courts were a, a way for local people to bring grievances to the attention of the military, like regarding like how soldiers were behaving, and to ensure that they were adhering to not only but largely what's known as the Lieber Code, which was this sort of general policy around Union military conduct, like what warfare should look like. There was really this insistence upon maintaining this civil war as like this gentleman's war, a kind of conflict between a fraternal conflict between the white South and the white North. So these courts martials become very helpful as a sort of tool and framework, because we see how Black women and girls get sort of like caught up in this makeshift wartime specific space that's not permanent, right? There's obviously like Southern jurisdiction laws and stuff like that, but that's kind of temporarily suspended because of occupation. So it's about what does life look like under Union occupation. And so I found these courts martials really helpful for the point of testimony. I was really trying to get as close as I could to the voices of Black women and girls, and not only to sort of understand their testimony within this specific context, but to think about articulation within this context. So, what does it mean that formerly enslaved, like refugee, like freshly, just off the plantation and towns and stuff, what did it mean for them to bring their testimonies to the courts, especially around sexual violence, and to offer a definition of consent that was presumed not even available to them, that they wouldn't have even have been aware of? That was the presumption, right? And also, what did it mean for them to kind of describe and locate harm and injury on the part of those who were supposed to be the enforcers of their emancipation? And so, what's really interesting to me with these Black women and girls' testimonies is that they're in this state of liminality. So, liminality is a theme that often comes up throughout my book project. They're not waiting for their status to be, determined as, you know, refugees or as free people, like across this sort of like time of transition and movement. They are defining for themselves, like, this is what it means to be injured. It doesn't matter whether you still see me as a slave. It doesn't matter if you see me as a citizen. This is how I'm articulating this sort of area of injury and harm, and I deserve sexual justice for that. So to me, that suggested something beyond a notion of articulation as citizens. It suggested to me an existing kind of ethos and understanding that actually had origins in the enslaved community, but with the first opportunity to actually speak out and speak more freely, they're seizing upon that and really demonstrating their ability to navigate these courts.
Mm-hmm. And what did sexual justice in the 19th century look like?
Ooh. Well, I won't say that, many were successful. There were some cases of success in that the assailants were, you know, sentenced to jail time or had to pay a fine or had to conduct a certain number of years of hard service, for example. But I think the kind of major outcome of that could be imagined at that time is the recognition, right? And I talk about in my article how Black women and girls are using this as an opportunity to really do away with a long-standing tradition where sex was assumed as part of the sort of labor that they could offer, right? And so the women and girls who entered into these courts tended to be servants working in, soldiers' quarters. They were laundresses. They're working in close proximity to their assailants. And so they're really making a point about what does it mean to sort of join the war cause, right? To be a working woman and to contribute to this war effort without this constant threat of sexual violence that has been a threat in their lives as enslaved women and girls as well. And they're really trying to to sort of sever that association to say, no, this is not going to continue into this new life that we're building and this sort of like new space that we're building together.
Mhm.
Yes, that shaping of their own boundaries, not waiting for them to be given a certain status, but redefining consent, defining consent in their own terms. Dr. Owens, in what ways did redress show up circumcised in the records that you looked at? What was justice in the records that you were looking at in New Orleans, if it was there for enslaved women, free women as well?
Yeah, that's a really hard question. I mean, I want to first pause and just say that, Kaisha, the way that you were articulating um what Black women were up to is so smart. That's totally stunning that they're not just reacting to this changing legal regime and saying like, oh, I'm included. They're saying we have a pre-existing theory of our own bodies that we now know we have an opportunity to deploy, but that theory is sort of organically developed in the context of enslaved communities. That is just astonishingly smart to me, and I really appreciate you articulating that, and also this like asserting a new set of boundaries is really just super smart. So thank you for sharing that. In terms of redress and justice, I don't know. I think that one thing that I try to work through in the book and that became apparent to me in trying to tell the stories of enslaved women who were engaged in sexual labor in the antebellum South is that the notion of justice or freedom is not like a place that one arrives at, is not sort of like a horizon that necessarily guides the thinking of the women that I write about. I think of them as having a fairly tight kind of time horizon in their view, which is individual. It's about their own lives and the lives of their family and community members. And I also think of them as having a really realistic sense of the world that they live in and that they have to navigate, which is to say that, justice or freedom are these like kind of incredibly ideologically dense and often materially fraught concepts in American democracy. And it's not obvious to me that the women that I wrote about were seeking those things in the context of their pursuit of the courts and other kinds of stratagems. And so I really like, Mimi, that you raised the question in terms of redress, because I think that's like a much more that can be articulated in so many multiple formations and is kind of a more dynamic term. And I think that I don't know that the women that I wrote about were seeking redress so much as trying to chart something different forward. Like, I don't think that they had any expectation that they were owed anything. And that was almost never part of the part of what they were asking for, unless there was like money owed, right? Like back wages was part of redress, like, because a lot of the cases that I write about are about wrongful enslavement. But I think that I see them pursuing the courts to say, like, the situation I'm in is bad. If I engage with the state in this way, I might be able to have ownership rights over my own body. I might be able to have or maintain ownership rights over some property that I'm occupying, or some work that I'm doing. I might be able to have or maintain the freedom of my children. I might be able to basically be unbothered. Like, I mean, I think that's a big part of it, is just like, whatever is happening now, like my capacity to do what I want to do on a day-to-day has been constrained so profoundly that I need to have an intervention here. But you can tell also that there's like a time scale over the course of a lifetime in which enslaved women are like seeking the first opportunity to seek intervention. And sometimes it seems to me that they're also like, well, things are well enough, but then something else comes in and changes the story, and then they have to seek the court. So, you know, I don't think of them as being like, okay, I'm just going to bide my time for 10 years. And then when the time, you know, I'm really thinking about in 10 years, like my strategic plan, in 10 years, I'm going to go to court. And then in 20 years, I'm going to be free. I don't think of them that way. I think of them as more like the time scale of survival is so small, because they could be dead at any minute. Like, they could get hit in the head the wrong way. They could get, you know, their children could be sold. They, like, so many things can happen so quickly. And so I think that when you're under that kind of, I mean, I think honestly, like the social science literature on racial stress has really helped me think through this also. Just like, when you're under that kind of acute stress, it takes up such a huge part of your brain that your ability to like strategize about the freedom of your people or about sexual justice as like a broad category is extremely limited. And so instead you're saying like, okay, do I have food tonight? Okay, do I have a place to sleep? Okay, am I going to be unbothered? Anyway, so I do think that the cases that I see, it's almost like something has happened that has like push these women over the edge, or something has happened where like a loophole has been created and they can scoot through it, and they're alert, they're aware that like they're, you know, the loophole's open, I'm going. So anyway, I think basically, to answer your question finally, a kind of unbotheredness is, I think, at the heart of what maybe redress would look like, though I'm not sure that's really the framework that I would use to describe their experiences.
Okay, thank you for the added context. In both of these specific temporal spatial moments, how do you think your historical actors viewed consent as a useful framework to even describe their own experiences? What were the boundaries of consent for Black women in the 19th century?
I mean, you know, I'm pretty suspicious of consent as a framework, I think, and I've learned that from women in the 19th century. So it's like, yeah, it is a leading question. Thanks, Mimi. I think that I think consent is a tool of violence that it's a little bit like colorblind racism, you know? It's like, it makes you think that it's not there. The violence is not there. It's a guise almost. So anyway, I think that enslaved women and Black women more broadly in the antebellum period, I don't know that consent was the word that they were using, but I do think that they were completely aware and sometimes quite verbally specific about the kind of sexual and reproductive labor that was built into the legal regime that they lived under. And that there was a kind of ritual charade around asking for sex that was part like the ritual of asking was part of the regime that demanded sex. And so I wonder a lot, and I have never really come to a satisfying answer around what good sex means in the 19th century for Black women or anybody. I just think that that framework is like a very modern idea. And, you know, Sharon Block talks about like the distance between sex and force in the 19th century or in early America is like the two things are just understood to be in relation to each other. And that's not even like just about enslaved people, although it's fully expressed around enslaved people. But like, you know, I think that the notion that sex is outside of commerce, is outside of domination, is this kind of exceptional space, is not super relevant here. So if consent is a really highly valued legal and sort of political ideological tool in contemporary feminism, you know, it's really articulated much more in terms of will in the 19th century against her will. Like, it's not the notion that her will could be a desiring active will is a very 20th century idea. Will is mostly articulated only as a thing that one could have acted against in 19th century law. So anyway, I just I don't know if the question of what is consent in the 19th century is a question, which I know it's not for you, but I'm just saying, like, I think it's often a question articulated as like, what is good sex in the 19th century? Like, I honestly have no idea. And I don't know that it has anything to do with consent. As we see it as a kind of modern conception. I think if the question is like, what did enslaved women understand about the sexual regime that they lived under, I think they understood it better than anybody else. And they understood that that ritual of exchange was at the heart of the whole project and was one of the many, many ways that sex was mobilized as a weapon against them.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I also struggle with the term consent because in part I see, especially during the Civil War period, with those records, the word consent does come up fairly often in the courts. And I'm sort of torn between understanding it as a term that these women and girls knew to use so that they could, you know, use a language that was legible within this specific environment. Emily, your point about these transactions and the sort of, I also have a copy of your book and I love your book, by the way.
Thank you.
But yeah, your discussion of the kind of the it's the kind of play-by-play that often predates that just comes before like the point of violence. And I would say that's even part of the violence, the kind of offering of money and gifts in exchange when there's clearly that power difference. Like that continues into the period of the Civil War, and many of these women and girls understand that as like part of the whole parcel of you know, this kind of violent event and this sort of broader violent culture as well. But in terms of I always come back to one particular case that I came across in my research involving a 14-year-old girl called Rachel in Tennessee. And she lived within a kind of known quote unquote house of ill fame, so a brothel, and was likely a sex worker in some capacity, though that's not determined for sure within the record. And she was attacked by a white Union soldier and brought, you know, charges against, brought this to the attention of the local military court. And she was repeatedly questioned about, you know, the kind of existing environment that she had lived in a way that was suggesting like, look, you're a sex worker. How can this be raped? This is just part of the work that you do. This is your life, basically. And she just kept saying that she did not consent to these various stages of kind of acts by the soldier against her. She was saying, I allowed him up until this point, and then after that, I did not consent to it. And she was then questioned and asked whether it was because the soldier was white, whether that was the reason why she did not consent to going all the way with this soldier. And she said yes. And so to me, that was interesting because she wasn't kind of connecting consent in this 19th century legalistic way to the sort of notion of like feminine virtue and morality and, this idea that I want to remain a virgin until marriage, and he sort of violated that will. It was more about the ability to articulate and like maintain the control around the borders of her own body, and to say when and where a person can kind of sort of enter, right? to quote AJC. And that was just really interesting to me because it was really forcing the court to think about a more sophisticated notion of consent. This notion of like ongoing consent, right? What we would today call sort of ongoing affirmative consent, to say, yes, I might consent to one thing, but that doesn't mean that I've consented to everything, right? And also the fact that she said she didn't, consent to the full act because of the man's race, suggested her own sense of individual moral taboo ideas that helped her understand her own sexual subjectivity in that period, right? In that moment where she's thinking of herself as sexually sovereign, only, and therefore needed to be respected on her own terms, right? And so I think her use of consent seem to suggest it's not just the legalistic consent, it's like a social understanding of consent, but it's also murky, and it's really hard to kind of pull apart like when consent is like in this legalistic sense, or this sort of sense of like Western liberalism, and when it's just like I allow this and I don't allow this, and it's not necessarily this sort of like transactional nature. So it's tricky. I also struggle with consent, and I agree that consent in this context, like the other side of it is violence. It's very related to violence.
Mm. Both of you are really invested in intellectual history projects. You're viewing enslaved and free Black women as, in a very Barbara Savage way, as intellectual crafters of their own identities, their own survival strategies, like you said, Dr. Owens. And so what does it mean to view these Black women as crafting a lineage of ways to protect themselves from sexual violence, ways to strategize through a legal system, ways to survive? What does that added dynamic mean to your own work? They're not just surviving, they're crafting an intellectual lineage of survival.
Yeah, I recently read Shannon Eves's book. The copy is in another room. I can't remember the title right now, but it's about it's thinking about the antebellum South as having a rape culture. And one thing that stays with me from that book is the knowing. And I would connect the knowing to this kind of intellectual project that you're referring to, Mimi, where knowing becomes not only a form of sort of resistance, but it becomes like a form of survival. It becomes a blueprint for future generations. And I think there's a lot of power in that, where especially coming out of the enslaved context where it's the whispers of grandmothers and mothers and the kind of everyday things that they might say to their daughters while washing them, for example, that becomes the sort of conduit that's carrying on this sort of knowledge, right? Where young enslaved girls sort of understand and learn more about various life stages and what it means to enter into a period of their lives. So obviously, Harriet Jacobs talks a lot about this and talks a lot about the sort of principles that her grandmother inculcated in her. Like, I see that as part of this lineage of intimate values, intimate moral and relatedly sexual values that are kind of in the backdrop, in the background of these enslaved resistive cultures. And I sort of imagine, what does it look like to think of a kind of plantation field or a cabin or a kitchen where utterances of these forms of knowing are being shared, and it's held by the receiver to the extent that it's not only being passed on to others, but it's also in particular moments lending itself to action, to other forms of resistive action. So yeah, I do see it as a form of survival, but I also see it as a kind of, it's the opposite of like the whole social death thing, right? It's a lineage, it's a connection, it's a sort of heritage that's being passed down. And I just think it's an incredibly, it's hard to grasp at time, but it's at times, but it's a very powerful thing. And that's really what I'm trying to sort of connect to as part of my intimate history that I'm writing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really interesting, to think about lineage as a response, like intellectual lineage as a response to social death, like conceptually. I think that's exactly right. Like if you're cut off from the notion of being cut off from a kind of like social community is also about the notion of being cut off from a kind of intellectual project. So that's a really interesting frame. I really like that. I think that, you know, you mentioned Rutgers a while ago as this kind of engine of a moment that we're having in women's history. And I think that for me, when I was coming up in graduate school, the African American Intellectual History Society was just being formed. And, it's now like really big and important and great, but it was like, 15 people getting together at a conference and it started. And that really shaped me as a thinker. So, and it was a little bit by happenstance. Like, I don't think I understood my project as the history of an idea for a while, but early on, maybe also because Black feminist theory is kind of my intellectual home, thinking with that conversation is so symbiotic with thinking about African American intellectual history and thinking about the history of Black people who are thinkers, who are theorizing their experience, which is to say they had ideas about what was happening to them that were deliberate, that were fully expressed, that were not reactive, or not only reactive. Like, so I think in a way that twin space of like being trained in Black feminist theory and, thinking about Barbara Christian saying like a quilt is an extraordinary piece of artwork. It has this emotional meaning. It has this aesthetic meaning. It also has intellectual meaning, right? Like there's also knowledge there. So kind of part of that, or like that tradition really informed who I thought I was looking for in the archive, or like what I thought I was, what I recognized when I saw these women doing their thing. But then also just I happened to come of age intellectually in the context of the intellectual African American Intellectual History Society, and so that also really nurtured my thinking, and that community of conversations and scholars really nurtured what I was able to see in my archive. And I think it was later, I think as a dissertator, I thought I was writing a story that was about sex work and violence kind of on balance. And I think as I transitioned into my book, I became much more clear that the story was primarily about violence, and that getting to violence through sex work made it possible to understand the violence better, but that it wasn't like a social history of sex work and a social history of violence, but it just happened to be that starting with sex workers made it easier to understand violence. Anyway, through that kind of reframe, it became clear to me that this was very much about the history of an idea, and that the history of consent and how it is moving and shaping a society was really what was happening there. And so in a way, I end up writing a kind of an intellectual history of violence on the one hand, like that's also part of it. So I think in a way, like seeing the Black women that I wrote about as themselves interacting with this idea is sort of the other side of it, right? Like seeing a kind of story about Black feminist theory in this archive, but also seeing that like really what I was trying to do was grapple with the way that lots of people in the society worked with this idea of consent, and with ideas about violence and harm and injury, or its lack, or imagined lack. So I think that's also part of it for me too. It's just like intellectual history became a framework for seeing what I guess I thought was sort of legal and social history.
Mm. Thank you for that, Dr. Owens. So we're at 2 p.m. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. But to close up, I would love if each of you could suggest a book for people to read. What is a book you're reading right now that you think people should read? Doesn't have to be history, doesn't have to be about our topic today.
Okay, I'm reading 2 books right now that I just started, both of them, and I'm very stoked about both of them. They're both very different. One of them's in the office, and the other one's next to my bed. So sorry. But the one that I'm reading Wendy Rouse's book, Public Faces, Secret Lives, A Queer History of the Women's Suffrage Movement, which is basically about women in pants. It's awesome. It's a really cool read for lots of reasons, but one of them is that in that it's repopulating the history of American women's suffrage movement, and rightly so, but also because she's trying to think queerness as a method for doing history, and I'm really interested in that right now. And the other book that I just started, because it just came out, is my colleague Mike Vorenberg's book, which, gosh, what is the title of that book now? It's about Lincoln's attempt to end the Civil War, and it's really about rethinking the many endings. It's called Lincoln's Peace, and it's about ending the many ways that the Civil War ended, right? So like if Appomattox is one ending, there are many, many, many other ways to imagine that story ending or not. And so each chapter sort of works through these different episodes that might be understood as the ending of the story. And when we end the story here or there, the meaning of the war is different. So endings are part of how we develop narrative and analytic meaning about things that happen. So I think I'm enjoying it because the writing's really great, and because it's Civil War history, which is like a little bit of an outside field for me, but also one that is enriching what I know. But also, and also with respect to this conversation, has everything to do with violence. But the other thing about it that's really cool is it's like pointing to some methodological questions about how we tell stories that I'm finding just super, super helpful in this moment.
Thanks for that.
For me, I'm coming towards the end of my sabbatical, but I'm also transitioning into maternity leave. I'm almost 7 months pregnant right now. So I've been reading a lot of like books on nurturing and stuff like that. That's kind of where my headspace is. But I would say the last academic book that not the last, but one of the last academic books that I read was Shannon Eaves's book that I mentioned. And I've been able to recover the title. It's called Sexual Violence in American Slavery. And I just think in terms of a text that visits a history that we know about, but there's still so much silence around it. I think it does an excellent job of kind of slowly, to use Emily's point about this sort of like slow work, slowly going through what this violence means and how sexual violence not only impacted enslaved women, but impacted the entire culture of the antebellum South. And the stories of, sort of divorce court petitions between mistresses and slaveholders said so much about this sort of general cultural violence, as much as the kind of instances of violence between slaveholders and enslaved women themselves. So I would highly recommend that book. An older book that I absolutely sort of return to over and over is by Trisha Rose. It's called Longing to Tell: Black Women Talk About Sexuality and Intimacy. That's just been a book that's followed me through each of my chapters, just for kind of framings, for just a reminder to sort of like stay close to the voices of subjects as much as possible, and just listen to them and let them direct me in my sort of storytelling. So yeah, that's another text that I would suggest. But as I said, I'm reading a bunch of maternity books right now, so that's kind of where I am.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Let's all give a virtual round of applause to Dr. Esty and Dr. Owens. Thank you all for being with me today. This was fabulous. The RAI is going to have more Elaine Locke seminars, so make sure you check out the website. I think they put a link in the chat. And that's all. Thank you all so much. Have a great Friday wherever you are in the world.